Hey friends, welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. Here's my conversation with David Finnegan-Hosey about his book, Christ on the Psych Ward. And this podcast includes a co-host, a co-interviewer, Mike Stavlund, author, frequent listener to this podcast and many others, and champion smoker. He's my own personal meat smoker, so if I'm going to have a big get-together, Mike gets flown in to take care of the masses. He's done it in Minnesota. He's done it in California. He's extraordinary. The conversation today is great. It engages David's book, Christ on the Psych Ward, and deals with issues of mental illness, community, faith, thought, how we engage with one another, how we think about these issues. I think you're going to love it. So here it is. And take a minute and pick up the book online. Go into Amazon or Barnes & Noble, Christ on the Psych Ward. And while you're there, think about becoming a Patreon member over at DougPagitt.com. Chip into all this goodness going on. But even if you don't, enjoy this great conversation. Two of my favorite people joining us today, David Finnegan-Hosey and Mike Stavlund. And I should say, and Mike Stavlund's beard. I feel like it's. I feel like there are multiple guests, and David has written this fantastic book that I hope all of you will find important and engaging, and buy it for yourself. And it is called Christ on the Psych Ward. And it's not a book about Jesus being crazy. It's not an argument in the Lord, liar, lunatic construct of the 1980s that for some reason I remember. It is a conversation about the role and the impact and effect of mental illness on people and how communities and people of faith can engage in these. So, David, congratulations.
Thank you.
Excellent. And Mike, we brought you on because you are not only a very a wise person in your own right, and a frequent listener to this podcast and live stream. So I'm so glad to have you on. It's actually intimidating. You're a super listener. But you are an author yourself, and your book, Force of Will, is a life-changing book that people should read. And there, as David and I were talking before we came on here, there's a lot of connection between these two books because they both deal with issues of story and the question of how do we engage with one another on issues that are difficult and heavy, and how do we do it? Your book documenting your own story of the loss of your son Will, and how people engage you and you engage them in the midst of that kind of struggle. So, talking about mental illness and talking about the death of a child, these are heavy conversations for a Monday afternoon.
Yes.
In March, when people are thinking about March Madness or something.
Real life, though.
It is real life. Can you guys say something about that? And David, if you'd give a few thoughts on writing a book like this, like how does one endeavor and engage in writing a book like Christ on the Psych Ward, where it's not only your story but your reflections on complex issues?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So Mike is actually going to be kind of interviewing me as well at our DC book launch, and the reason. One of the reasons that my wife, Lee, and I sort of, as we were bouncing around ideas for what that book launch would look like, thought about asking Mike was exactly because of this thing of us both writing these books that are like, telling really hard stories that don't necessarily have shiny, happy endings. Yeah. And the struggle of like, okay, how do you tell a story like this that's difficult and that doesn't just sort of resolve very neatly, but at the same time, like I want to provide some sort of hope, some sort of something that I'm offering. And I don't want this to just sort of be like voyeuristic, like I'm just sort of dumping my pain out, for everyone to see. And so that's hard to do. I think I don't know that I've done it well. I hope I have. But I think one of the ways that played out for me in writing the book is that I knew kind of from the beginning that it wasn't going to be sort of just a linear progression of like this happened and then this happened and this happened. And part of that is that there's nothing inherently very exciting about psychiatric hospitalization in and of itself. Like it's actually, it's a little bit boring. not much of anywhere you can go. So that's part of it. But part of it too is that when we have these experiences in our life that are really disruptive and really painful, it does sort of throw us off in every single direction, right? It takes away that maybe core sense we have that our lives go along in this very linear narrative, and feels really kind of fragmenting and isolating in that sense. So I wanted the book to sort of represent that and to reflect that a bit. And I think, Mike, you could talk about this more, but, you had sort of this similar thing with your book of like, how do I make this book actually reflect the experience I was having and not sort of a gloss on the experience I was having?
And I think both of us were trying to keep fidelity with the people who are in the middle of something, right? So like you say, the happy ending isn't really what you want in a book like yours. And I think it's hopeful, right? But yeah, if someone's in the middle of their own struggles with mental illness, a kind of like happy ending, everything turned out great and now my life is perfect, it just rings hollow and feels very alienating. And in fact, distracts from the real truth of this, which is there isn't a happy ending. Right?
Yeah, right.
You're doing a lot. I think you said it's been like 7 years now.
Yeah, just about. Coming up on 7 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And 7 years since what? David, say 7 years since.
Yeah, 7 years since I first admitted myself into Sibley Hospital here in DC, into the psychiatric ward. So it was the summer of 2011, and then I spent about 6 months in and out of various hospitals, and eventually ended up in sort of a longer term program at a hospital in Connecticut. And I got out from that program in December of 2011. And so far, that's the last time that I've been a patient, an inpatient psych patient. Yeah.
But I guess the point I was trying to make too is like, and that's where you're at.
Yeah.
Right? All of us are in the middle of our stories and all the ups and downs. And it's not like we have some promise that everything's going to be better. It's a constant, it's an ongoing experience that you're talking about. So like, I appreciate you saying like, it's been a few years, but that doesn't mean I won't go back. And that wouldn't be, it wouldn't invalidate what you're saying here today.
Yeah. I don't want anybody to get to the end of my book and think that the success is that I haven't been back to the hospital. That is like, I'm proud of that, right? That's been a lot of hard work. And also if next year I do have to go to the hospital because that's the safe and good and right option for me, that's okay. Like, that's not a failure. That doesn't invalidate, the sort of the story that I've shared or the reflections that I have on it. And I don't want anyone reading it to think that like it would invalidate it for them, right? If they were to, if the hospital is the right safe space, then that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And Mike, your book called Force of Will, for people who are looking for that one, that you're not done with that story either, right? And this is a real sense that people can have. You're a book about grief and about loss and about the end of life. That's not something that not just that you wrote a book about it, but it's not something that someone would say, well, yeah, that was a while ago, wasn't it, Mike? And I know we all do that. We do that to one another in one way or the other, right? We do sort of create this linear narrative of time and tell ourselves and tell one another that, well, that was in the past and now you're in the present and soon you're going to be in the future. That's not always the best description for the difficulty of the emotional life or of emotional pain.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about grief, you're talking about a person, we don't want to move on and we don't want to forget. Like the task of grief is remembering. And as soon as you forget, then you're not, then that's a kind of failure. It's a kind of, there's a way to incorporate it into your life in a way that's less burdensome, I suppose, and distracting and just weighty. But no, I mean, you're always, that's grief is remembering, and grief is deciding, I don't want to forget. And to some degree, I don't want to feel better. I don't want to move on, that people kind of have that pressure sometimes of like, let's keep going. And this is another thing, like I said about David's book too, it's written from the middle of it, and it's not promising any kind of rosy ending, but I think that's a very hopeful way to do it.
And David, you chose to write this book to be helpful to people. You can tell a little bit about the story, but your book is trying to even help people who are in some kind of a community, whether they be faith communities or families or friendship communities, to know how to engage with one another around these issues. And I'll tell you, this is really complicated and really hard. I pastor a church, and there's people in our church who I hope will watch this, because I think they could use a lot of encouragement around the issues of dealing with mental illness, and especially dealing with bipolar, which is a diagnosis that, and I want you to talk about the whole act of diagnosis and of naming and all of that. But there's a diagnosis that you talk about in the book that's been offered to you to explain your set of conditions. And it's really hard to know how to talk about this. Like right now, thinking about how do I even use the phrase a diagnosis or not? And I know I might be particularly, I don't know, trying to be cautious and careful just because I'm trying to get good at that kind of thing in my life. But I know a lot of people feel this pressure. They're not even sure how to address someone if they know that person has a mental illness. Do they call it a mental illness? Do they call it a condition? Do they say just, how are you, and kind of avoid it? Like, it's really complicated to know how to do this. When I was writing the little Facebook status about us having a conversation today, I had to look on the book to say, oh, does David use the phrase mental illness in the description? Should I use the phrase mental?
I wrote it down to make sure I said the right thing.
Yeah, you had that same experience, Mike.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Can you help some of us know how to think about that? And I get, granted, it's your perspective, and I'm not expecting that you're going to speak for all patients in a hospital or everyone who's.
I have a friend with a mental illness.
Yeah.
I have the universal take.
Yes, no, please don't.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I just, to affirm the instinct, right, of like, you looked at the language that I used and used that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really helpful sort of baseline place to start, is like, what's the language that people are comfortable using about themselves, and reflecting and mirroring that language. So like, I mean, a good example of that I cite in the book, I prefer sort of person first language. So I talk about myself as a person who has bipolar disorder. But there are people who are like, no, actually, that's really cumbersome for me. And so I just say I have bipolar, and I'm really okay with that. Like, or I'm bipolar.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that phrase.
Yeah, and if I'm not going to go like correct that person if that's how they're comfortable talking about themselves, right? So I think that's a good instinct to mirror the language that people use. The other thing I would say is that, and I say this pretty much every time I kind of talk about the book or talk about my story, I try to say this because I think it's really important. I was really, really lucky. I had quite a few people come to visit me while I was in the hospital, which isn't the case for a lot of people who suffer. For a lot of people, the experience of mental illness, in addition to the painful experience itself, is also this really socially isolated experience. So I had a lot of people who came to visit me, and I don't remember a whole lot of what they said at the time. I mean, my mind was, going in a million places at once. I really had this sort of this tunnel vision that I couldn't I couldn't perceive reality very realistically at times. I don't remember a whole lot of what people said, but I really, really remember who was there. And so the idea of being present with people who are going through something, it sounds so simple. It's actually quite difficult. It's really, really important. And I think one of the truths in that, the sort of paradoxical truths, is that a big part of why people end up saying kind of quote unquote the wrong thing. Part of that is just, I don't know, right? It's just sort of like simple ignorance. And part of it is I'm trying so hard to come up with the right thing to say that I sort of, get myself trapped in this, mental maze. When maybe this person just needs me to sort of be with them, check in with them. How are you feeling today? Kind of things. And it's like, that sounds so simple to say, but it's actually tough, right? It's tough to just sort of hold space for people. It's sort of an acquired skill.
Oh, it sure is. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So,
because you want to have that second thing to say, right? So a lot of us get comfortable. We have a first thing. How are you? Or how are you feeling? Or, and then there's a response. And then after that, that's when you have to practice and get good at it. And so I would imagine people who are in your situation, who are struggling, in their own experience, that they're living in their own experience, and then they're watching other people struggle with knowing how to interact with them. You're kind of having to carry both burdens in an interesting way, right? Like you're having to coach people in how to think about this and talk about it. And you're not the only one. People who suffer from other physical illnesses, cancer diagnosis, I've heard this from a number of people who have cancer. They'll say, especially if the cancer diagnosis is one where treatment's not going to end in ridding them of the cancer, they'll say, like, people don't know how to talk about it, and I have to sort of work both sides of the conversation, which can be particularly exhausting, I would imagine.
Yeah. It is. It's exhausting, and you're already sort of taxed, emotionally and mentally, right? Because of the nature of the thing. So, so that makes it really, really tough to do. And you're also, I think, trying to coach people to something that just, it isn't there, right? So there isn't like a right thing to say or to do that's going to make this better. We don't even have that medically necessarily, much less sort of emotionally, or right. I mean, there isn't, right. The process of trying to figure out what's the right kind of intervention to help somebody with a mental illness. There's more we don't know still than what we know. This is the cutting edge stuff, right? This is the brain. We still don't know a whole lot. And so there isn't necessarily even something that a doctor is going to be able to say, okay, this is what we need to do. So like, if you're coming and you're my friend, like, let that pressure be off you, right? You're not going to fix this. And so, just be here. And you might say something stupid, right? But be there, and, try to reflect the person's language and try to sit with them and try to hold the space for them. I'd say that's the most important thing. It's not the only thing, but it's the place to start.
And what I found helpful from both of you in your books, and part of this language bit that for me matters, is that the language we use becomes part of the story that we're framing. Right. That's partly why I'm trying to be careful with it, is because I know that my language reflects a set of assumptions I have and where I think the story is. So if you ask someone sort of, how are you doing today, that frames it in a story of one kind. And if you say to someone, are you staying on your medication? Are you still on medication? That frames it in a different medical kind of a way. And if you say to someone, are you feeling safe now? Or how's the grief going? Those are all statements that aren't just a use of language. They're creating a particular story that then the person you're talking to has to jump into your story or not. And Mike, your book in Force of Will, you bring people along in the sense of your own. Almost as that book is so great because it's almost like it's trying to show people the framework of a story of loss that a lot of us don't have we don't know it. Like we don't. This is new territory for us, and that's the beautiful crossover, and why it's so great to have both of you on here. Is that's a crossover between both of your books and both of your experiences.
I think for me it was kind of working out my frustration because I wrote kind of during that first year of grief, and I'm sure I was. David's more generous than I was. He's like, "Thanks for being there. He really appreciated that." I was a little more unbearable, I guess. But yeah, there's that sense, because I did feel that at the time too. Like there's a sense of like trying to choose how you're going to engage with somebody. Are you going to accept the terms that they bring, they're bringing to this, their assumptions? Are you going to accept the comforts that they try to offer you?
Right.
I have a friend whose wife died suddenly and unexpectedly a little over a year ago. And I was talking to him the other day, and he is like he's hardcore. He wants to feel everything. He wants to remember everything. He doesn't live in the house where they lived anymore, but he's kept it everything like she left it. I mean, he's really serious about experiencing this kind of grief. And he was telling me that sometimes he tells people about it, and other times he doesn't at all, because he he just doesn't want, like you're talking about, Doug, that sense of like, do I want to wrestle with someone else's narrative or someone else's paradigm of why I should feel better? And the thing I told him was, I've been telling him this for a year, I think that's about the other person. They're uncomfortable with your experience and they're scared of it themselves. And so they're trying to make themselves feel better by telling you something that'll make it better, help it go away, or whatever that is. That they're trying to get you on their paradigm so that they don't have to feel so awkward about sitting with you. And I don't know, David can speak for himself about this, but I appreciate it when people just talk to me about the weather or took me to lunch, or we didn't have to talk about it. I really appreciate it when people, if I wanted to talk about it, they let me, but it wasn't like I was working through it. I was dealing with it. I cared more that people cared about me. Yeah. People brought me my favorite junk food or said, hey, today was a day you got up and put on pants. This is a good day.
I still count that as a good day, actually, if I'm not wearing, if I've grown up and literally not wearing sweatpants like I might be right now, that I consider that to be a real win. And so I guess there's a sense that there's this like normalcy that people can bring. On the other hand, around mental illness, that's a very loaded concept. I know a lot of people who in their professional lives do not want the word to get out that they are have been diagnosed with a mental, or they will reject a diagnosis because of the implication that it has. And there's a lot of secrets around it. There's a lot of cover up. You write about that in the book, that you kept your own experiences a secret, even from the people closest to you. There's a lot of, I don't know if it's shame that produces it. I don't know what the motivator is, but there's a lot of keep it quiet and secret. And people have paid a great cost. I know people who have lost jobs or not been certified by their religious groups, or were sort of excluded from the places that they felt themselves qualified because a diagnosis became a stigma. And so stigmatizing isn't just an interpersonal problem. It really has consequences, real world consequences. David, can you talk a bit about that? And if this book, how you feel like Christ on the Psych Ward contributes to that conversation, or what you've seen going on in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that question, because I think it's legitimately complex, right? In the true sense of the word, there are all these sort of intersecting things going on in that conversation. Part of my motivation for writing this book is that I felt like I could tell this story and help break some of that stigma and break some of that silence and get away with it, because I have some other types of privilege that buffer me a little bit, right? And not everybody does. So I know, for example, I have some friends who are women in academia, and they are not going to go and talk about their mental health struggles or their mental health diagnoses, because they're already in an environment where they're kind of constantly having to defend their legitimacy to even be there because of sexism, right? And so, and you can name all sorts of other examples that carry this similar thing of like, right, this really is still a stigmatized topic. These diagnoses are still stigmatized, some of them more than others, right? So that people have a legitimate concern that if I share about this, or like you said, if I accept this diagnosis, that I'm then professionally doomed or sort of going to be get booted from a faith community, or right, that there's some legitimate concerns there. So I think that then makes the telling of these stories and the sort of creating of spaces that we can tell these stories in really, really important, because it starts trying to shift the dynamic within that system so that this no longer becomes a stigmatized topic. And also, right, that then brings us up against these other pressures or sort of power dynamics that are working against folks that kind of double up on that stigma or triple up on that stigma.
Can you say a bit about why, what the impulses were that you were feeling that led to you keeping your own experiences and diagnosis quiet or in a secret from people who cared about you? What was going on there?
Yeah. So I think, right, just to say, like, right, I talk about in the book that leading up to the week where I finally reached out and got some folks to help me get into the hospital, right, there was this sort of downward spiral that went on for probably a few months and then really intensified in this like really, really awful week that finally led to me getting into the hospital. And yeah, right, I kept it from like my housemates who I was living with in DC, who were really good friends, who would have been happy to help, right? And I think part of that is shame. Part of that is that mental illness is sort of a liar. I mean, mental illness kind of like says to you, you don't have friends, like nobody's here, nobody wants to help you, right? That's the illness itself is kind of kicking that talk at you, right? So you have like the reality of shame, the reality of stigma, and the experience itself.
Interesting,
yeah. And, you know, other kind of factors play into that, right? I think like for men, for example, in this culture, admitting that we are weak and need help and can't just push through or power through. I think, you know, women have a similar kind of thing where they're expected to sort of juggle all these balls and keep them all up in the air perfectly at all times, right? So then there's these sort of societal pressures that come in that actually have nothing to do per se with mental illness. But it's saying like, you should be able to just kind of power through this.
Yeah, right.
Through this.
Especially if you're kind of weak in your mind, because people connect mind with will and can't you overcome it? And there's a whole set of narratives that would say,
right. Yeah. Can't you just, exactly.
Buck up.
Yeah. I talk about, you know, like one of the ways that, for me, like my experience with bipolar played out was with the urge to harm myself, right? Which is a really difficult thing to talk about and for people to understand. Yeah. And in my own mind at the time, I was saying to myself, like, this is a thing that like high schoolers do. Right. Like that was my own internal narrative was like, I should be over this. This is like, yeah. Well, I mean, that's like an internalized message that I picked up from somewhere. Right. That was clearly not true. You know, clearly my experience was this is what was happening. But I was saying to myself, like, well, I should be over this. I should be, which is pretty rough on high schoolers, much less on me. Right. I mean, like, it's like, you know, that when I think about, like, if I can kind of like pull that statement out and analyze it, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of stuff in there that I don't believe at all. Like, I believe that the experience of teenagers ought to be valued and listened to. And I believe that, like, you know, there's all sorts of things.
All kinds of beliefs. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, so that's a lot, you know.
I appreciate it. The book does a great job, David, of kind of working against the kind of projection that we talked about before, where people will say, I I've been down. I think I know what depression is like, or I feel anxious sometimes, you know, and David does a great job in the book of saying, okay, I understand you feel anxious. Here's what anxiety means to me. This is what it's like. And it's a really wonderful, vivid description of just how awful it is, right? Same thing with the kind of, if I'm manic, this is how it feels like. If I'm depressive, this is what it feels like. It was just a great thing to sort of say, all right, this is wholly different. This is like, my economist friend calls it an order of magnitude different, right? Like, and I think that's a helpful thing for people to learn about is it's nice to empathize and to feel like, well, I have some sense of connection with David or other people I know, but I also need to remember that maybe I don't have that good of a connection.
Yeah, it's like, it's both a spectrum and then there's a cliff somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's true with that's definitely true with mental illness. It's true with other, like people with chronic pain, right? I mean, I've experienced pain, right? Like the experience of pain is a human experience. And chronic pain is this whole different, like you said, order of magnitude, or right? Like it's both a shared experience that we have, and there's a really important difference. And both of those can be important realities to name, right?
David, I think the whole book is obviously worth people buying, but I found chapter 7, the chapter that's titled Diagnoses and Demons, a really powerful chapter. So I think if someone's like scanning on Amazon to decide if they want to read the book, or they're just trying to get freebies out of it by searching the book, search for chapter 7 and take a look at the beginning of this one. If you're, if you can't get over to the library to get a book for nothing, you might as well steal from there. So if someone's not willing to buy it from you, that's a great chapter. And you start out that chapter with a quote from a psychiatrist that you met with, who said, "Patient histories are stories." And then there's another little bit that I want to read back to you, because one of my favorite things is to read authors' lines back to them. A little later in that section, you say, "What is the story that we tell about mental illness? Is it even an illness? Is it demon possession? Is it personal anguish, best resolved with the power of positive thinking? The question of what story we tell about mental health struggles is an important one, because if it's not asked out in the open, we will never be quite clear what we're talking about when we talk about healing or recovery either." So you're raising this whole question of, hey, not only does a person live with this as a particular struggle, but we really need to do a little investigating about what the particular stories are. And then this chapter, you go in to suggest there's the medical story. There's what's been classically the traditional spiritual story. Then there's the kind of personal growth and recovery story, and how people identify their relationship to it. This whole question of the stories that we find ourselves in when we're engaging in this seems to really be at the heart of this book. And I think one of the great reasons to have Mike on here, because there's such power in that. Can you say a little bit about the critique you bring about the medical storyline and how it reveals a lot? I think you have this great way of saying in there, it reveals and it also conceals. So the gift that it gives, that it shows you something. You talk about your own, use of drugs and pharmaceuticals, but then also it covers up something. And the traditional spiritual story conceals some things, but it also reveals something. And that question about which story do you want to describe yourself in the midst of, what's going on with that, but especially this critique of the medical storyline, as powerful and helpful and important as it is. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I should say, right, I mean, I actually kind of debated, I just took my meds before I came on. I actually debated waiting to pop my lithium on camera to sort of destigmatize that. So
sort of show what that looks like when a guy swallows a pill.
Yeah, right. It looks like any other person swallowing a pill. It could be an Advil. Right. So I talk about the medical model as somebody who is very much grateful for and participates in the medical model. Right. I take medication. I go and see a psychiatrist. If you're having struggles and it feels like something that's totally out of control, I encourage you to go talk to a psychiatrist or talk to a mental health professional, right? So I'm a big proponent of the model, and it's a model, right? So it's helpful when it's helpful, and it's not when it's not. And and a lot of the ways that it's unhelpful have to do with how we, particularly kind of in the West, think about medicine. That isn't necessarily, it's a viewpoint. It's not necessarily objective reality, right? So the medical model tends to be very individualistic and very focused on pathology. In other words, it's focused on what's wrong with you, rather than either what's healthy with you or what's going on kind of in your context or in your community, right? So it kind of it focuses in by its own nature, by what it does well. It focuses in on a very particular part of the human experience that isn't the whole human experience. And it tends to be a bit reductionist, right? It takes the experience of a mental health crisis and reduces it to a particular diagnostic label that has particular then kind of treatment options that come out of that, right? That's how it does its work. That's how it does the important work that it does. Yeah. But that is a reducing down of a complex experience into a pretty narrow stream, right? So what this psychiatrist I had at the last hospital I was in sort of says is, he's talking through this and he's giving me a different diagnosis than I had received before. He's saying, well, I think we might be diagnosing you as bipolar. And I'm trying to understand that. And he finally kind of stops the conversation and says, look, this is a story. Like you're telling me, here's what I'm experiencing. And I'm trying to take all of these different things you're telling me. And I'm trying to say, okay, well, that looks like this thing that we have in this book called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, the DSM. And he's like, this is what it is. This is the label that we're going to give you so that we can prescribe medications and so that we can suggest therapies. And so that, but that's it. That's all it is. It's not, it's not like you get the right label and it's kind of like, ta-da, so yeah, I think that the medical model is really important in that when it leads to treatment, when it helps us destigmatize, it's really important. But it is, it's right. It's a story. It's a model. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mike, what are your thoughts about that? This idea that the different fields provide for us a different narrative path that we can follow, and it serves us while we walk that path. But there might be other paths that we could take at some point. How do you?
First thing I think is that David's really smart, and he's thought a lot about this. I feel a little intimidated trying to follow that. I think that's a great way to look at it. We don't have to get the whole thing figured out. We don't have to solve the problem. We need to have it work.
Nice.
I think the particular challenge David writes about too is, you might get the right med, but it might not work for weeks or months. It's a long process to work through. But none of that's ever really going to fix it either. And I think that's, I agree with the psychiatrist too, like that as David was talking about, because you might get the right diagnosis, but that might not be the only thing, or that might not be the forever thing. Mm-hmm. And as David soberly says in the book, this is incurable, right? Yeah. That's the reality that a lot of us are living with is, we're going to try to manage this. We're going to try to live our happy life. I think David's living a great life. It's great to set down his book and talk to him and remember how intelligent and smart and funny he is. But it's all of us are kind of managing the things that are the messes in our lives as best we can. And that's okay. And that's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think it's like the medication can do some really important stuff. I mean, so I have some friends who had some pretty severe experiences with depression, and they got on the right meds, and they were like, that's great. I can see in color again, and sort of everything's better. Yeah. And that's what I needed. And I don't really need, it didn't, I feel no kind of identity crisis around that. I feel no, and that's awesome, right? I mean, I think if you kind of enter into the medical model and it gives you what you need and that works for you, then that is super good and positive. And I want to 100% affirm that. Mm-hmm. For me, and I think for a lot of people, it was hard. It was this really hard brain shift to get around of now I'm this person who needs this medication. And that was like an identity shift for me. And maybe I can't even 100% articulate why, but I think that's true for a lot of people. There's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that that a big reason that people with mental illnesses stop taking medication that they know to be helpful to them is because they've what they're looking for isn't not having to take meds. It's that they want taking meds to be part of a sort of holistic kind of psychosocial, spiritual response to what they're going through. And if you've got, which we do, not enough mental health professionals in the community, and your psychiatrist has basically 10 minutes with you, then what they have time to do is say, here's your prescription, right? Here's your prescription. Here's your prescription. Well, that's not even like that satisfying if I just have a physical illness, right? I mean, if that's kind of the level of engagement I have with you, and there's no time to talk about like, well, I'm discouraged by this, or I'm struggling with this, or these side effects are really bothering me. And then, that feels pretty alienating, isolating too. And you can sort of forgive people for saying like, what the heck with this?
Yeah. And I could imagine if people are in another story and they want to try some of the other storylines, that people in one's life, someone's life might come around them and say, hey, look, this is really taxing on all of us. This alternative or this narrative storyline that you're in, or kind of working on your whole life. I get it, that's what you want to do, but can you just go get on something and kind of help the rest of us? Now, whether they say it that bluntly or not, I do think that's an awfully common experience that people have. At least the feeling, or some people in their family or people at work will say like, hey, this is really, can't you get a pill for that? Isn't there a thing you can take for that? So it's almost like we live in this world where the medical storyline carries a lot of weight that the other storylines don't particularly have. And so once again, now a person's having to negotiate a set of interactions.
Yeah. And like, that's such a great example, right? Because that's a really good example where the medical model and medication is being used as a narrative framework rather than as the actual thing that it is, right? So like I'm interning right now it's called clinical pastoral education, so a hospital chaplaincy at the National Institutes of Health here in Bethesda, Maryland. So some of the best doctors in the world are here, right? And this wonderful research hospital. And it's really interesting to talk to these folks who are like, leading these cutting edge research projects and say like the National Cancer Institute. And they're really, really humble about what they know and what they don't know, because they're out on the cutting edge of it.
Well, so that's good to hear, because most people don't experience high capacity doctors as being predominantly humble and unsure about what they know.
And we expect doctors to fix us, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of doctors take that on, and so when they put that white coat on, right? And so these sort of like in this research setting, these doctors who are way out on the end are like, look, there's like a lot we don't know here. And we can't just wave our hands and magically fix stuff. We can try this, but it might have these side effects.
Yeah, and, I'm hearing that in the conversation around the gun debate, and this idea that what we need to do is deal with the mental illness problem, right? This is how it comes out. And then the idea is, so that I hear these interviews. I listen to a lot of National Public Radio and the propaganda from the left, and they'll have these psychiatrists on, and the psychiatrists will be like, whoa, hang on a minute, like don't dump this on us. We're not going to solve this problem. You make it sound like we can just solve the mental health crisis that people are having. But first of all, that's not the motivation for most people who are committing acts of gun violence.
Right.
But even in the cases where it is, this isn't like we should just solve this. And there's this weird dialogue happening in our society about is it solvable, and is the problem, well, there's just not enough mental health workers. And if we had enough in all the schools and at work and in all the places, and enough appointments and enough insurance, then we would solve this. But the problem is the distribution system. And you're suggesting, well, the problem isn't only the distribution system; it's also the actual cure or response or tools that they would that someone would use. That gets complicated and can feel a little depressing to people. Not to use the word in the wrong way, but it can be really demotivating, where people say, well, then what are we going to do? Isn't there a solution to this? Okay, so that was a bit of a preachy. I want to ask you one more thing. Is there something, and Mike, I'd appreciate your thoughts on this too. Is there something going on where to explain the increased number of people diagnosed with bipolar and other similar mental health issues? So many people that I know in my life will identify with this diagnosis. I don't feel like 15 years ago, and I don't think it's just that, I've now reached the age where people are telling me these things. It seems like there is a real uptick. People are writing about it. There are books, your book, Sarah Lund has a book, Monica, like 3 people I know are writing books about spirituality, Christianity, and mental health around bipolar and other issues. So it feels like there's sort of this big uptick, and it reminds me a bit of the ADHD conversation from the early 1990s where there was an increase in diagnoses and people started to say, hey, look, we're just overdiagnosing this thing. We're just trying to, this is a bit of a catch-all. Is there something going on? Is there something environmental? Is there a way this is being diagnosed? Is there some, or is it really just this is coming out of the shadows and people have dealt with this level of mental health crisis for a very long time? Do you have a sense of that? Do you know what I'm getting at with that question?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really complex, right? Because it's one of these things where if we're trying to break the silence around something and we're trying to sort of end stigma around something, is the good news that we're seeing more of it or less of it? Because if we're successful in ending stigma around something, we'll see more of it before we see less of it. But how do you gauge that that's what's going on instead of that something else is going on, right? And I think it's a tough question, right? I don't know that I have like a simple answer. So I think part of it is that we are successfully starting to push back against the stigma and against sort of the family secrets and stuff. I'll share sort of a story from my family, right? So mental health problems, mental illnesses run in my family. My dad talked with me about his he has kind of major depressive disorder. He talked with me about that when I was like a teenager, and that was a big move for him, right? He had to do some work to get to the place where he could do that. I think it was his grandmother who used to go away for a while to volunteer as a nurse. Right. That was the sort of the family story.
Yeah.
Right. That she'll be gone for a while, volunteering, and probably she was in a hospital somewhere dealing with some sort of mental health issue, but nobody would talk about that in the family. So I think we have had a really powerful culture of silence around this stuff that started to break away. So we are going to start hearing it. I think too, part of it is that this is like a really tricky area to dance around in. And
I was nervous bringing it up.
So it is not the case that people who are creative are necessarily also have mental illnesses, nor is it the case that people who have mental illnesses are necessarily more creative, but a higher percentage of people who are kind of engaged in creative work tend to also have mental illnesses. So, and Kay Radfield Jamison does some really important work. I'm blanking on the name of her book that's specifically about this now, but
Unquiet Mind.
It's not Unquiet Mind. It's one of her other ones that specifically deals with creativity.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm blanking on the name of it, but right, of like this tricky balance of like,
right. You hear those stories like, boy, if they had medicated Picasso and all this kind of thing, right?
Right. But I do think that like there is not causation, but sort of this interesting correlation. So that if you're at a place like Solomon's Porch, or if you're friends with a lot of people who are doing really creative things, maybe you're bumping up against the fact that like creativity and a mind that doesn't work in quite the linear way that are sort of these maybe correlated things. And I also think, I mean, sorry, I'm sort of rambling, but it's a lot. But
what we do here.
I think there is also the question of, with this stuff that's kind of invisible, how do we make sure that we're diagnosing accurately and not just throwing diagnostic labels onto people because it's convenient and helpful, which kind of brings it back full circle. If everybody who comes to a mental health professional, if we feel like we just have to slap a label on them, then we're going to end up slapping a lot of labels on people that aren't the right label.
Sure. And I know there's a lot of complexity around diagnoses that then allow for insurance to kick in. So someone has to have a diagnosis of some variety. And so there's a lot of work being done around the labeling and the languaging. I think one of the things, and I could be interested in your thoughts on this. I feel like part of that this fits into a larger conversation in our society where we're recognizing that the sense that there's a myth around the sense of normal. That's a big thing that's happened, that we're starting to recognize that some of us have talked about, well, there's kind of normal life, normal genders, normal sexuality, normal businesses, normal mental health. And then there's a few people that are outside of normal. And we should deal with that and kind of have a place for them or kind of be kind, but just recognize they're different than normal. And I think part of what's happening is we're realizing, that the sense of normal isn't a very accurate representation. That's a real myth.
Yeah. And you can only sustain it as long as you push people into the shadows on the side or sort of relegate them to a second class or lesser status. I think that's exactly right. I think we're starting to recognize diversity in all kinds of ways and appreciate it, right? I'm a huge fan of, every time I have a conversation, I end up talking about The Walking Dead. The comic, the TV show, it does a great job, I think, of this very point. Like if normal disappears, that is, your house isn't worth anything anymore. Your bank account's meaningless. We finally reached the end of capitalism and society and everything else. Civilization comes to an end. What are you left with? And it's fascinating. There's several characters in that genre or in that story, in that universe, who you kind of suspect as you're reading and watching, they've got a kind of mental illness. It's an amazing adaptation, though. And that deficiency, that lack of normalcy makes them really good at some things. And makes them, in this case, survivors and people who can adapt and cope and do some amazing things. And I think it's a kind of a critique of that. To me, that's a place where I've seen it in kind of popular culture. But for sure, and I was going to say too, and I like David's response, but for me, I think it becomes more normal, less unusual, because that so many of my friends, people that I know, have kind of pushed back on the stigma and said, no, that this is who I am. This is what I've dealt with. And I know my kids see that as well. I know the literature my 11-year-old daughter reads, the fiction she reads, has lots of these themes kind of woven into it, destigmatizing a lot of things that were stigmatized for people. My daughter's a generation younger than me, so
which is typically the way it works with children and adults.
But I mean, it's interesting to sort of learn from your kids and see, they're getting a whole different set of cues that are much better. And I hope that there's that great Springsteen line, Doug. I don't know if you heard of Bruce Springsteen.
I've seen pictures.
Okay. Well, now I'm blanking on the line. I hope my sins are my own. My mistakes should be my. If I had one wish, in this godforsaken world, son, it's that your mistakes would be your own, that your sins would be your own. And I think in this case, like that wrong way of thinking is being kind of released in some great ways.
So the last question that I have for you. There's this kind of common parlance around phrases of things are crazy, or someone's a psycho, or it's nutty. All these kinds of euphemisms we use to describe something being unusual or abnormal that I mean, I've just become extremely sensitive to those things. You know what I mean about saying, but we don't have the other word. Like something could be crazy and fun, but it seems like no. I feel like that's all part of this storyline of normalcy that we need to work on. And maybe this is one version of this paranoia I have about this is just make everyone so scared you can't really say anything without feeling guilty, and send people away to have those private conversations in dark bars where this stuff seethes for years and then comes out sideways. Or the other is this invites everyone into the project, right? Because a lot of us use language like that, or we do want to say something that to sort of describe the Mad Hattery nature of things, until you realize, oh, Mad Hatter was the idea that came around with someone who worked with mercury, and they got mercury poisoning, and they were poisoned into craziness. That's why they're called Mad Hatter. We all get invited into this project in some way by saying, hey, we're all in it. This is not like, well, there's people who deal with mental illness, and then there's people that are normal, and then there's people who care for those, and we all have our roles to play. In some way, we're all mixed up in this, which is why I think your book is helpful, and others. It draws people in to say, hey, you're in on this project a bit. Do you have any last thoughts on that act of making these tough issues? And in this case, I think it could connect with your story and the book The Force of Will, because death is the thing that death and birth are the two things that every human being who has taken breath will experience. And yet we still deal with death as if we have no capacity to deal with it. And a lot of us are dealing with it with a real lack of social interpersonal maturity. So it's not the common nature of it is what I'm getting at in this long-winded, soliloquy here. But the common nature of it doesn't seem like on its own, it being common is necessarily going to help us to deal with it in more appropriate ways. I think there's a belief that's the case. Like, let's make it more accessible, and then we'll get better at it. How a lot of us deal with death, our own impending deaths, or the death of others, seems to argue a bit against that. But do you have some sense about how we can all be part of this project?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's, I'd say on the language piece, right? I think that this is, I've become much more sensitive to the language piece for myself since I went into the hospital. But it's actually like, the term crazy isn't the thing that gets me kind of like, nah. Oh. It's when people use actual sort of diagnostic language to mean something entirely off. Because I think that does have the impact of making it then more difficult to people who are actually dealing in the diagnosis, diagnosis language, to be able to communicate what they're going through.
You mean like if someone says, "Oh, he's acting totally psycho or schizo," or something like that? Yeah,
like psycho, or we use schizophrenic to mean. We'll say like, "Oh, the weather's really schizophrenic today." And
I see.
That means like the weather can't make up its mind, right? But schizophrenia doesn't mean you can't make up your mind, right? That's like right. Not. I see what that label holds. Or people will say do kind of a similar thing with bipolar, like. Oh, I'm so bipolar today, I can't decide on a restaurant. Like, well, that's like, it's not that I couldn't decide on a restaurant that led me in the hospital. Right?
I've never heard that. That's amazing.
But I think underneath that, what's probably the important core thing, right, is that in community, we can have these conversations, right? So like in a good community, like if Mike says something that kind of bothers me, I can say, hey, Mike, you said this thing, and this is kind of what that brought up for me. And Mike can say, oh, yeah, I hear that. Yeah, that's my bad. I didn't but I was kind of thinking of this thing, and we can kind of like have a relationship and have, so we can have these conversations when we're in community with each other. And we know that this is a community where we can talk about this stuff. So I'm actually like kind of less concerned with making sure everyone uses the right language than I am with how do we create the kind of spaces and communities where we can have good conversations around language. Because the truth is that there isn't a universal answer, right? Like for one person, one type of language might really bother them. For another person, they might be able to brush that off entirely. How do we know? Well, we know by creating these spaces where we can kind of have these conversations. And I think that that's where that takes some intentional work to, get people together, lay some ground rules, create a space that kind of feels safe enough to open oneself up, but brave enough to do the opening. So I guess that's to me. I like your image of kind of inviting people into the common project. So how do we do that in our faith communities, in our schools, in our families?
Well, one of the ways people can do that is to buy 150 copies of Christ on the Psych Ward.
There's no limit. You can buy as many as you want.
As many as you want.
I know that's true, but I did look on Amazon the other day, and they were sold through and waiting for new ones to arrive.
Oh. Yeah. Which
so
I had,
congratulations, and sorry about that.
Is that good? This is my first time doing this. I had,
it's not as bad as some of my books, which are listed as currently out of print. So no, it's not. It's not that level of bad. But you do want someone to be able to get at like right now when they go on to barnesandnoble.com, it's for you, Jane Love, or to amazon.com and say, I want to get a copy of this book. They can. Hey, are you I heard you say you're going to have a book party out in the Washington, D.C. area, Virginia area, right?
Yeah. In D.C. at the Potter's House on Columbia Road, March 20th. 6:30 p.m.
March 20th. That's coming soon. That's next week.
Next Tuesday. Yeah.
6:30. Yeah. So if people are around town, they can swing by. People can travel from out of state if they want to.
Sure. Yeah. You can come from anywhere.
Stay at the Trump Hotel, something like that. Why do I have to ruin a perfectly good conversation? It's so close. Yeah. There are 5 different times I said, do not make a Trump reference right now. But I just picture people staying at the Trump Hotel and then coming over. And,
we talked about mental illness for an hour and didn't mention Donald Trump.
Not even once.
That was almost.
So that's, are you traveling anywhere else? Are you going to be somewhere? And if people wanted to have you be in a conversation via the internet or in person, is that something you're open to?
Yes, absolutely. So you can go to christonthepsychward.com. So just the name of the book, .com.
That .com was available.
Yeah, .com was available.
I thought you had to get a .us for that.
And that has both my currently sort of booked speaking engagements. Great. And also a form you could fill out if you want to invite me either in person or to Skype in. We're also going to have, this coming week, we should have a study guide posted up on the website. So if you want to buy the book, do a book study in your church or in your community, there'll be a study guide, and I'd be happy to Skype in for that for one session. Great. Or something like that. So yeah, christonthepsychward.com. Would love to hear from all of you. And A Force of Will, also available on the internet and from.
That's a good question. There may still be a few copies at Amazon. Otherwise, you can get in touch with me because they're in a box.
You got a basement full of them. Yeah, we all do. Hey, thank you, David. Thank you, Mike. Congratulations to both of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really great to be part of this. And thanks everybody who's been willing to pay attention and watch online.